My name is Catherine Stoner. I'm the director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is the home of the Democracy Action Lab. Yeah. So I'm going to hand things over to the director of the Democracy Action Lab, co-director, who is coming from Mexico City, and that is Alberto Diaz-Calleros, who's going to introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion, and then we'll turn questions over. I guess you're coming back to me, and then we'll have questions. There's Diego. Okay, Alberto, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, everyone in the CDDRL community, for making this event possible. And thank you also for all the people who are joining online, to the attendees who are online. This is obviously a topic that, most of us kind of felt, I think, on the night of the 2nd to the 3rd of January, that we were in a very different world and that everything has changed. At the same time, I should say that from the perspective of us as scholars, we are very attentive and have been very attentive already for quite a while of the events and the processes going on in Venezuela at CDDRL. And I would say that, even though I will let our panelists, who are all Venezuelan experts and Venezuelans, most of them, they will let us know about their perspective of a very difficult moving terrain. It's a very difficult assessment right now with the facts that we know. But there's three things that have not changed, and I just want to highlight those before I introduce our speakers. Nothing has changed on the basic underlying economic conditions of Venezuela that forced an exodus of 8 million people away from that country, together with the political conditions of the country. Nothing has changed in its oil investment, its oil infrastructure, the collapse of the social services. All the economy of Venezuela keeps on being the same 2 days later. The government which is in office is still the same government that came into office through an electoral fraud, of an electoral victory, where there is no question that Edmundo González won the election. And we know that these are basically the government in office in the absence of Maduro. And the third thing I want to mention is that the political prisoners of Venezuela keep on being in the prisons, in the Licoide in particular, and one of our own community members from CDDRL, Jesus Armas, is still detained in Venezuela, and I want us to be aware of that. Once I've said this, I do want to introduce our panelists. I will introduce them very, very briefly. You can go into our webpage in CDDRL to see a longer bio. But we have Harold Trincunas, who is a senior research scholar and deputy director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation, this CISAC at FSI. He has examined various issues related to civil-military relations, ungoverned spaces, terrorist financing, emerging power dynamics, and global governance, and with a particular knowledge of the case of Venezuela. Maria Ignacia Curiel, she is a research scholar also at the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, and an affiliate in our Democracy Action Lab that has been created recently. She's an empirical political scientist who uses experimental, observational, and qualitative data to study questions of violence, democratic participation, peace building, and representation. Then we also have with us Héctor Fuentes, who is a visiting scholar, also at the Democracy Action Lab and the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, CDDRL. His research focuses on the Venezuelan elections, in particular, looking at the dynamics that led to the semi-competitive election, the strategic success or failures of the opposition, and the windows of opportunity for transition to democracy in Venezuela. We have Diego Zambrano, who is a professor of law and associate dean for global programs at the Stanford Law School. He's also the faculty director of the Newcomb Center on Rule of Law, and he's also an affiliate of our Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. And he has explored various issues on the legal landscape of Latin America, and particularly the role of Supreme Courts, among many of the research agendas that he has. And finally, I will introduce to you Dorothy Cronick. She's one of our very proud, we are also always very proud of our alumni. She's an associate professor at our neighboring institution in Berkeley at the Policy School the Goldman School of Public Policy. She studies contemporary Latin American politics, emphasizing Venezuelan politics in particular. One of the most keen observers and analysis, I think, of particularly using the most cutting-edge research methods to look into the questions of Venezuelan democracy, among other issues. So we have a very, tight, very packed room of people, both virtual and physical. So what I will do is we will try to have 5 minutes for each of you. You will just go in sequence, and then we will ask questions from the audience. Ask the audience to ask their questions. For those of you who might be Spanish speakers, I recommend that you put on the caption or the AI features of Zoom if that makes it better, and you can put your questions onto the chat in Spanish if you need to, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. So thank you so much. Harold, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and apologies for my voice. I am one of those who is sick. So I'm going to try to literally just answer the question that's in the title of the talk today: democracy, authoritarian rebalancing, or chaos, I believe was the other option. And let me start with democracy very, very briefly. As much as I think all of us would aspire that this would be a transition to democracy in a relatively quick timeline, especially given the overwhelming victory of the opposition last year in 2024 presidential elections, we have to be realistic that even if that were to happen, it would be a very difficult scenario for the new democratic regime. We have to remember that all the institutions of power and all the electoral offices in Venezuela below the president, many of those are held by Maduristas or Chavistas, supporters of the regime. In many ways, even if you got to transition, you'd be in a situation that recalls Nicaragua in the 1990s, where the new president, Violeta Chamorro, and her chief of staff basically had to negotiate with the Sandinistas of what the new democracy would look like, and ended up with a situation of many reserved domains where the Sandinistas continue to have power. And the other thing is, even if you try to resolve this by calling for early elections, of course, that would be very threatening to all kinds of power groups within the country who undoubtedly would stir up trouble. And the new regime would have weak to no support from the security services and the armed forces. Certainly among the high command of those, the opposition is not popular. Let me turn to authoritarian rebalancing, which is where I think we seem to be headed right now, with Vice President Delcy Rodriguez being named acting president, with President Maduro being jailed in New York. I think this would avoid some of the potential problems that are often associated with foreign interventions. If you recall Alexander Downs' book from 2021, Catastrophic Success, he basically outlines he basically shows that something like 1/3 to 40% of all regimes installed by foreign intervention end up in civil conflict within 10 years. It's almost half of leaders installed by foreign interventions withdraw from or are pushed from office before their term is up. And two of the mechanisms which he identifies leading to this, one is the dissolution of the security services early on, which creates the conditions for insurgency. And the second one is the divergence between the interests of the intervening power, in this case, the United States, and the local, the local population and local power elites. So clearly, with the current version of authoritarian rebalancing, where Rodriguez stays in power in some sort of coalition with the Minister of Interior, Diosdado Cabello, and the armed forces under General Vladimir Perdomo Lopez, the people with guns stay employed. So that avoids that issue, the first mechanism. However, the second mechanism seems to be being triggered at light speed, I think sometimes, by the statements by President Trump on sort of keeping all the oil. That's likely to rub people the wrong way in Venezuela. I'd even point out that in the Venezuelan armed forces, long before they were transformed to be Chavista or Madurista, protecting Venezuela's natural resources and its mineral patrimony, its wealth, was seen as one of the rationales for the existence of the armed forces. If you go back to the 1970s, look at the national security doctrine at the time, the rationale they came up for why they exist, the military did, was to defend Venezuela because it was a very rich country and somebody would come and try to steal its wealth. So I think this will go over badly within the armed forces. And finally, on the chaotic issue, the possible end of chaos, I think I'll let others speak to that. I know Maria Ignacia has been doing some thinking on this. Others may have as well. Obviously, this could happen. There's three remaining power groups now that the Maduro Flores are in prison. That's Delcy Rodriguez and her brother Jorge, who leads the National Assembly. The Minister of Interior, who controls security services and these so-called colectivos, armed gangs and militias, and then the armed forces proper. And so you can imagine a scenario where there could be a falling out that would generate some chaos. Obviously, the U.S. would be trying hard to avoid that happening, but that is always a risk. And as I think two other risks, and I think I'll again allow others to talk about, I'll just mention them. There are ELN, Colombian insurgent forces in Western Venezuela that are operating. And there's also, of course, the Maduro Flores group, which was quite significant within the power coalition. Where does it go? Nobody's talking about them. I wonder what they're up to. Let me turn it over to the next person, Alberto.
So this is a great segue, I think, into Maria.
Excellent. Harold just sort of served me directly, and I'm sorry I'm the second person that's sick, and then I think we're out of sick people on the panel. So following up directly on Harold's comment, I think an important feature that I find is not as discussed, at least not yet, in the discourse around sort of the possibilities of what might happen in Venezuela has to do with a variety of armed groups that operate and that exist in the country, and the possibility that these groups engage in violence or unleash some sort of chaos, and if not, sort of what these groups will do to adapt to the new reality, either in the short or long term, which may of course change. So I think we can think of armed groups in Venezuela largely in two broad sets of categories. You have the state armed forces and non-state armed actors. And the state armed forces are hardly a unitary actor for a variety of reasons, but we can think that these sort of coup-proofing strategies that the Chavez and Maduro government have invested in for a long time means that you have a variety of entities within these armed forces in the state that have sort of competing or overlapping priorities, and that they've for a long time had some sort of fragmentation that's been built into them, which means that it's sort of unclear where necessarily their loyalties lie and how this will unfold. And then importantly, you have the non-state armed actors, which, as Harold mentioned, include the guerrilla insurgencies that are on the western border of Venezuela with Colombia, that control large swaths of territory, as well as sort of important mining of gold and other rare earth minerals, which is done in total coordination with the Venezuelan government, as well as these other kinds of entities that are colectivos, which we can think of as sort of urban guerrillas, or I guess paramilitary entities. And all of these groups are understood to have not just incentives to preserve the status quo, but also they've had sort of arrangements that have been important for their survival up until now. And so there's a question that these groups face of like where their arrangements stand. And with the loss of Maduro and Flores in particular, we'll learn the extent to which their arrangements depended on Maduro as opposed to other members of the current governing coalition, and the extent to which they feel like their arrangements are under threat, which might lead them to respond with violence, or the extent to which they'll engage in chaos. And I think one important thing to note is that what we've seen on the streets in Venezuela in the last couple of days haven't been state security forces. It hasn't been the National Guard. It hasn't been military police, as far as we know, but rather it's been these colectivos, or at least that's what it seems. And so, what we take from that, knowing informally that these colectivos are associated to be under the control of Diosdado Cabello, as opposed to other formal security forces, like what we can gather from that, I think is sort of important to consider in what the state of the security apparatus in Venezuela is at the moment, and the extent to which there is this competition between these different members of the governing faction in Venezuela or not. I think that's about 5 minutes, but we can continue on to the next.
Thank you so much, Maria, for being so, very, very, keeping track of your time as everyone else. Hector, please.
So the situation is extremely fluid. I'm going to try to talk about a little bit of the role of the opposition in all of this and the expectations of a lot of Venezuelans about the opportunities a process like this entails and the challenges ahead, as well as my previous colleagues have been describing. So there were a lot of concerns that democratic transition was finally going to be the end goal of this process in the last couple of hours, particularly because the opposition has been sidelined from the process, and also because we haven't seen many statements on behalf of the administration saying, democratic transition is going to be the final commitment, the ultimate goal of this operation. But today, Secretary Rubio, speaking to Congress, described a process that entails 3 phases: stabilization, recovery, and transition. Stabilization is going to mainly be about security. So the tension here is the complexity and fragility of the Venezuelan state on one end, and on the other hand is that a stabilization without the democratic end goal doesn't seem sustainable or possible. And I'm going to explain why. So stabilization is going to be mainly about security and keeping oil being exported and some cash and revenues coming in to avoid humanitarian crisis that could spur more migration. Recovery is about opening the country to foreign companies in the Western world, mainly, and trying to increase the oil production, the revenues, and with that, hopefully stabilize some public services. Just to give you a sense of how things are, kids are going to school twice a week because teachers have to do something else in the other 3 days to be able to compensate for the income they don't receive from their salaries. So this tells you about the collapse of the services. So at this stage, Rubio described that some sort of reconciliation, amnesty, opening, reconstruction, civil society has to happen before the final stage, which is a transition, which we hope or expect is going to entail elections, is going to happen. And I think the critical point here is that the infrastructure and the oil production capacity of Venezuela is so weak at the moment that in order to increase it, you do need some substantial investments. And I don't think, and this is what CEOs and executives from oil companies that have been tested, are you going to come in Venezuela? To Venezuela, what they say is, we first have to see infrastructure, institutions, policy, stability, political legitimacy being established first before going in with huge investments. So what we'll see is low-hanging fruit, fields, oil fields that are easy to exploit, but the exporting capacity or the production capacity of those fields is not going to be very huge. So the stability is not going to happen unless you promise and commit to the final goal of a democratic transition, in my opinion. Also, thinking of domestic politics in the US, I think Republicans in Florida are worried about the repercussions that denying or trying to just engage with a authoritarian rebalancing could have with the Cuban and Venezuelan community in the south of Florida. I don't know. There are experts in the room who can tell me how important Florida is for the Republicans these days. But some people think that the Democrats won't have any success in the south of Florida for a generation because Obama tried to normalize relationships with Cuba. And I think just stopping in an authoritarian rebalancing in Venezuela has similar potential to harm the political group that tries to leave this as the end goal. So Florida is important, and if it is important, I think the administration is going to have a lot of incentive to say the end goal is going to be a democratic transition. But this is, of course, the US is not the only player in this ecosystem. As Harold was describing, the removal of Maduro leaves three main power groups in the ruling coalition in Venezuela. These are Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez. Delcy was Maduro's vice president and now is acting as the interim president. Diosdado Cabello, who is the interim minister who has control of the colectivos, but also some influence in the army, and then the defense minister, who we could consider at this point hardliners, if we try to put it in the literature of Lins and others. And I think these are the main spoilers, domestic spoilers of Venezuelan administration that wanted to cooperate with the US for a democratic transition. I think that the main instinct of the regime, following the recipe of their Cuban authoritarian mentor, is resist, survive, and outlast. Is the main element of the recipe of Cuba when dealing with the US is resist. Some other crisis will emerge, the administration will change, the pressure will be eventually off. You just have to win another day. And I think the remnants of the coalition have a lot of elements to say, listen, dismantling this criminal structure is going to take a long time. But we have two thresholds that are important in this matter. Elections this year, midterms, who can alter the composition of the houses and also the level of control Congress has over the options that Trump has on Venezuela, and also presidential elections in 2028. The strategy for them is going to be, let's try to bend, not to break, concede oil, mineral resources, so that we can survive the Trump administration and see what other opportunities emerge in the future. I think this is going to be the strategy they're going to try to follow. And one, I think the last element I wanna tell you about is that there is a lot of mistrust, obviously, because such a clean operation wasn't possible without some inner cooperation. So everybody in that regime is looking at each other saying, who the hell betrayed Maduro, right? And then the winner, the obvious winner, is probably the guilty party. That's what they think. So I think there is a lot of mistrust at the moment. I think Delcy Rodriguez has taken a huge step yesterday to try to balance the coalition, and is allowing one of the main lieutenants of Diosdado Cabello to be appointed head of the Secret Service, which is the main structure in the country to impose the will of the authoritarian coalition to the other elements of the security apparatus and all of the group-proofing elements. And also that person is the head of the presidential guard. So she just entrusted her personal security and checking all of her communications to see that she didn't betray Maduro to Diosdado Cabello, who is a hardliner, who is a potential spoiler, as a trust-building exercise in my mind, and also as a power-sharing exercise to say, we're in this together, let's just resist. I think I will stop here. I have so many other comments, but I just want to hear what the rest of my colleagues have to say.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that it is our visiting scholar from Venezuela who gives us also such a nuanced analysis of US politics. I give it now to Diego, and I do want to apologize in advance that Diego has an overlapping commitment, so he might have to zoom out at some point. But Diego, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's really great to be here with all of you. I'll start with just a personal reflection because people always ask me how I feel about this. I'm very happy about what happened. I know that there's a lot of uncertainty, but at least this opens up the possibility of a transition which did not exist 3 days ago. So I'm hopeful with trepidation, and I trust what Hector is saying and what my colleagues have described. Now I want to wear my law professor hat, and I want to just address the legal questions here. On the US side and briefly under international law. Does the president have the power to intervene militarily in a foreign country like this without congressional approval? You can answer this question both from the domestic law point of view or from international law. Under domestic law, the conflict in the Constitution is clear because Article 2 designates the president as the commander-in-chief, while Article 1 gives Congress the power to declare war. But presidents have routinely asserted the power to engage in military interventions like this one, and nearly every president has done so. You can think about Kosovo, the Clinton bombing without congressional approval, President Obama's bombing of Libya in 2012 without congressional approval. So an important point to keep in mind is that this is not the kind of thing that ends up in front of a court because there is no standing to sue. No one can sue the president over this. So in practice, this is determined by the Office of Legal Counsel within the White House's legal apparatus and congressional reactions to how the president behaves. And so the best precedent we have is the Panama invasion in 1989. Back then, Attorney General Barr wrote a memorandum as part of the Office of Legal Counsel justifying that. And so I want to touch on that for a second. But like Venezuela, the United States indicted Noriega. The United States then, without congressional approval, and Bush did not communicate with anyone in Congress about this, ordered the seizure of Noriega in Panama. And it was a much larger military display, an actual invasion with tens of thousands of troops that took over a month to get Noriega. And after the seizure of Noriega, they brought him to the United States where he was prosecuted, okay, indicted over narco trafficking. I think this is an exact precedent for what we're seeing here. There are some potential differences that you might hear from some legal scholars that I can touch on. When Congress came back into session in mid-January, it did not protest at what the Bush administration had done. In fact, the House adopted a resolution approving what the president had done, not the Senate. So it was not a joint resolution of both houses. So this is of a piece with a larger history of congressional acquiescence to this type of presidential action. So the argument that Bill Maher made in this somewhat contested but famous OLC memorandum is that the president has the law enforcement authority in conjunction with the FBI to seize and indict a criminal abroad. Pretty simple. That's it. The president has the power under Article 2 to enforce the law by seizing a criminal. And it does not matter if they are abroad. And it does not matter if this violates the UN Charter. And international law does not constrain this domestic legal authority. It also does not violate the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on the arrest without a warrant. Any resistance to law enforcement then triggers self-defense. So the Trump administration can say the bombing happened because of the self-defense of the law enforcement units that were detaining Maduro. So that's the legal argument. My understanding from the best authority on this, Jack Goldsmith, is that this is at least a good argument at OLC. But again, you'll never see this in court. There are counter arguments I can talk about. What about international law? The UN Charter obviously contains a prohibition on the international use of force. The only exception is self-defense. It seems pretty clear that this is a violation of that prohibition. I don't think there's any plausible argument that this was in self-defense. So what should we make of that? I don't make much of it. Panama was a violation also. The world did not collapse after Panama. So was the Clinton bombing in Kosovo. And in fact, the White House explicitly said, we're violating international law, but we think it's right. So was Obama's bombing of Libya. This prohibition is violated 40 times in the last few years. This is one more violation. Is that good? No, that's not good. But I don't think it's a drastic change the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was. I'm going to stop there because that's 5 minutes, but maybe we'll get to Q&A. And if not, I apologize that I'll have to leave early.
Thank you, Diego. So this is, I think, a good point where we will have Dorothy joining us in your evening already out there where you are, Dorothy, right?
That's right. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to do my best to say something optimistic about the prospects for Venezuelan democratization. And I will admit that's not easy in this moment for many reasons. For one thing, obviously the rhetoric in Washington, right? Trump in his press conference on Saturday didn't even mention democracy and in fact totally dismissed Maria Corina Machado, Venezuela's most popular politician and the driving force behind the opposition candidate in last year's presidential election. And Trump actually described this military operation as a very precise attack on sovereignty, and then later said that it's too early to talk about freeing political prisoners. And then the following day, Rubio, in an interview, when he was asked about a timeline for elections, responded by just looking at the camera and saying, elections, and then explaining why it's premature to talk about that. For another thing, the current president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, is not a democracy activist. She's been in lockstep with Maduro for years, including in stealing last year's presidential election and in perpetrating human rights abuses. Her dad founded a political party that was a left-wing splinter faction of a party that was itself a left-wing splinter faction of Venezuela's Left Party. One Venezuelan journalist described that party this week as to the left of the Soviet Union, i.e. the right. Then Delcy's father orchestrated the kidnapping of an American businessman, and for that he was arrested and then tortured and killed by Venezuela's elected government, which I think most analysts have interpreted as very radicalizing. Just to give you a sense of, I think, how some friends in Venezuela are feeling about this, friends who, unlike everyone on this panel, maybe have not been following as closely, maybe did not anticipate that this was a possible outcome. I got a lot of texts on Saturday morning along the lines of, "We're free," cheers emoji, and then hours later, "Oh, but they're leaving Delcy in charge. It's the same government," broken heart emoji. Okay, and moreover, one more reason that it's a little bit hard to be optimistic about the prospects for democratization is one that both Harold and Hector alluded to, is that long before Maduro, under Chavez, Venezuelan political institutions and the Venezuelan Constitution enshrined high stakes of power, which political scientists for decades, at least since Adam Przeworski, have recognized as undermining democratic stability. By high stakes of power, I mean that winning or losing an election feels existential. So, Chavez gave the president huge control over promotions in the military, over fiscal transfers, the legislative electoral system massively overrepresents the majority, et cetera, et cetera. People recently have criticized both opposition politicians in Venezuela and also Chavistas for being maximalist and not wanting to negotiate and not wanting to share power. And I think it's important to recognize that these politicians are products of these maximalist institutions and incentives. And so, as Hector was beginning to talk about, re-democratization requires not only elections, but also mechanisms to make democracy sustainable and self-enforcing by lowering the stakes of power. Granted, that type of institutional reform doesn't seem right now to be at the top of Washington's agenda, but I am not willing to rule it out, in part for the domestic political reasons that Hector noted. Okay, so all that said, I want to say something more optimistic, which is this. There is still a lot of democratic infrastructure and what people used to call civic culture, democratic political culture in Venezuela today. And let me say what I mean by that. First is Venezuela's electoral technology. This is a technology, a vote counting technology that Jimmy Carter called the best in the world. I've done a lot of work on this, and this is a type of electronic voting that allows citizens to democratically monitor the counting of the vote and count votes themselves, as happened in the presidential election last year. One of the great paradoxes, I think, of Venezuelan history is that actually the quality of vote counting on election day improved dramatically, just as the quality of democracy overall was deteriorating. And then, technology aside, there is a decades-long tradition of mass political participation, extraordinarily high turnout, and really not only participating in elections, but participating in defending the vote and monitoring the vote. So I want to contrast this background and this institutional context with not only, other cases of attempts at democratization where countries are kind of starting from zero, but also other sectors within Venezuela. One person we don't have on this panel is an oil expert, and I'll just shout out also Stanford graduate, our colleague Francisco Monaldi, who just started a Substack, highly recommend it. This is someone following the oil sector, and he's written that the oil infrastructure in Venezuela is so deteriorated. It's going to take 10 years to rebuild, and we're starting from a very difficult place. And even though there's a lot of work to be done, I don't think that's the case when we're talking about democracy and redemocratization, all of which is why, despite the death this week and the objectively, I think, dark prospect in some ways of this Trump-Delcy Rodriguez duo, I am still holding out hope for the eventual redemocratization of Venezuela.
Much, Dorothy. This is great. I think it's incredible to see all of you doing this in just a few minutes and bringing us to so many questions. I have at least 20 things I've written down in my notes. But I do want to start basically in the room where Catherine will have the honor, I think, of trying to figure out how to handle the Q&A when we start. I'm still not sure exactly how to see the cues, the questions that might come from the attendees on Zoom. Adam Shaborsky happens to be actually out there. A shout out to him. But if I get instructions on how to check those, but let's get started with you, Catherine.
Okay. Mike McFall, I'm just going to call people out as I see them. And I think Kristen has a microphone so you can hear as well as the table. Go ahead, Mike McFall.
So Mike McFall, Stanford University. I have 18 questions to Alberto, but I'm going to limit myself to 3, and you can just answer any one of them. So first, this is a fantastic panel, lots of expertise. For those of us who are not as expert and read newspapers like the New York Times yesterday described Delcy Rodriguez as a reformer that had moved Venezuela from Marxist to some quasi-corrupt capitalist. Hector, I'm seeing you smile on that, so I know your answer, but I would appreciate you all describing her the way you think we should understand her, and contrast maybe to what the New York Times said. Second, other outlets have said that the opposition is divided, and the President of the United States, of course, said that the opposition has no support within Venezuela. Could you all comment on that analytically? How true is that? And then third, related to that, tell us more about both the regime and society and opposition's reaction to this gangster diplomacy that we're now doing, where we're extorting $2 billion from Venezuela to go to the American people and the Venezuelan people. I look at that as just a travesty. I want to be clear as an American, but I'm interested in how Venezuelans across the political spectrum are looking at that. And last, if I have one more last freebie.
My God.
Is there any hope for other actors, democratic actors in the region to play a facilitating role in transition, or is this just all about the United States and Venezuela?
All right. Wow. So you have more time now, evidently. You're not head of the Freeman Spogli Institute anymore. Wow. Okay. Who wants to take any of that? We've got Rodriguez, divided opposition, regime, gangsters.
Diego for a brief comment on the gangster diplomacy before we get to the others. Catherine?
Diego on the gangster diplomacy.
Wait, what's the legal angle there? Can you just repeat it? So
no, I'm not interested in the legal angle.
Yeah.
It's a completely illegal. I'm not interested. No disrespect to the law. It's completely outrageous. That's my view. I'm not interested in debating the legal aspects. I want to know how Venezuelans are thinking about giving America $2 to $3 billion.
All right. So
Hector will definitely know, but I will say, just as a Venezuelan, that I'm comparing that to the status quo, and the status quo is that our oil is given freely to Cuba and to China. So from the status quo, this is an improvement.
Okay. And you mean that there's a possibility of getting actually some of the revenue
That's
back
right.
to Venezuelans. Okay. All right. Okay. Hector?
I think that's how Venezuelans perceive it as well, mostly at least, because you were sending 50,000 barrels a day to Cuba, selling it to China to huge discounts, and then the little money that comes in goes into these bank accounts and nobody knows who handles them. So I think the promise, at least, of transparency and spending some of that money is an improvement, which is a tragic thing to have to say, right? This is how I think people perceive it. I haven't done a survey to confirm this, but I think the biggest disappointment people have today is the fact that they know the nature of the regime and that just Delcy Rodriguez is going to be incapable of moving substantially to a democratic transition. I think this is the biggest disappointment people are facing today.
Anybody else want to take the Rodriguez divided
Talk
opposition?
on the opposition support.
I was just going to say on the Delcy Rodriguez being a moderate, I think that is somebody leaking fantasies to the New York Times, Mike. She's been lockstep with the administration for a very long time. The best you could say is that she and her brother were more favorable to a private sector in Venezuela compared to some of the hardliners who favored more state control of the economy, but a private sector that was captive and subservient and paying kickbacks to the regime. So if you call that a moderate, then yeah, I don't know. I think the New York Times probably should do a little bit more independent fact checking.
Yeah, there was a lot of outrage about that labeling Delcy a moderate. I'm happy to take the question about Oppo support within Venezuela. So I think the starting place for that question, again, is the election last year, where Edmundo Gonzalez, the candidate backed by Maria Corina Machado, won 2-1. So won this election in a landslide with incredibly high turnout. I sometimes see this misreported as a contested election, a disputed election. The opposition claims they won, which is typically the case in elections in authoritarian regimes. That is not a good way of thinking about it. The opposition did win that election. And again, Venezuela's electoral technology provided the proof. And I've analyzed the data myself, like that is the outcome. Now, it is true, I think it is true that that ticket and Maria Corina perhaps did lose some support in terms of approval over the intervening year, both because the promised change didn't materialize because Maduro stole the election, and because of support for various moves from the Trump administration sending Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador and not condemning the boat strikes, etc. And that said, my understanding from pollsters who, yes, are still operating in Venezuela is that Maria Corina Machado remains Venezuela's most popular living politician. And so I think this idea that the opposition, that she has no support and respect, is not accurate.
I'll add to Dorothy's point on this question, because I think that's really the weakness, I think, of Maria Corina, is her ability to manage this ecosystem of armed actors in Venezuela, both state armed actors and non-state armed actors, sort of a very fragile set of agreements with all of these different kinds of groups to keep them happy and keep them from the rebelling. And there's a sense that she doesn't have the capabilities to do that. And of course, the opposition doesn't have their own security forces to sort of replace or integrate with existing security forces in Venezuela. And so there's an issue of like her capacity to govern in that respect. And so I think that's the only dimension where support is questioned, like specifically within the security forces in Venezuela. But I totally agree with Dorothy's point that sort of the widespread support that she had in 2024, even if some of that diminished over the last year, it's still very likely that she's by far the most popular political figure in Venezuela. And I think there was a last question. I don't know if somebody else wanted to answer. Maybe Alberto, you have thoughts on this about how other actors in the region, whether we can expect them to respond. I'll say something quickly, and I don't know if you'd like to add. I guess we'll see with sort of the new wave of more right-wing presidents emerging in the region in Latin America and what their disposition towards engaging with Venezuela will be. But we've seen the same kind of response from the 2024 election up until now, from Brazil's Lula, Colombia's Petro, and Mexico's Sheinbaum, which has been fairly limited. And I wouldn't expect them to have a role or to take any leadership in wanting to produce any sort of transition. We might expect something new from new right-wing leaders in the region, but they might not be the best suited, given that they're not exactly good intermediaries or credible intermediaries with a Delcy coalition.
Thank you. I will just say one brief thing, but we do want to have more questions from the audience at CDDRL, which is that I think Harold struck on this, and just reiterate that this kind of U.S. unilateral action does strike a very deep chord in the Latin American psyche, and it doesn't really matter if you're on the left or on the right. Something cringes in me when I see U.S. intervention, no matter how much, I can agree with Diego in terms of changing the status quo. But for Latin Americans, I think left and right, it's not just going to be about Petro or Sheinbaum. I think even the leaders on the right will have to pander to nationalist feelings that will be coming up from the public at large.
Interesting. Okay, so here's the list I have. Aaron Carter, Mike Albertus, Miriam Golden, and Oliver Kaplan. Just put your hand up or otherwise gesture, capture my attention. Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
Thank you for a really fascinating discussion. I'm curious.
Here comes the microphone too. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting conversation. I'm curious for any predictions you have about how other great powers, namely Russia and China, are involved in this in the.
Did you hear that?
Harold,
So go.
Much on that one, or Catherine?
I was going to say, Catherine, might have some thoughts on Russia. She's been talking a little bit about this. I could say one thing about China, maybe.
Sharing those with you. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I think one of the issues two issues with China, obviously. Aaron would know better than us that there's a big discussion underway in China about whether this is a model for what might happen in Taiwan. And in fact, Aaron, maybe you'd like to elaborate on that. And the second thing is obviously that China was a major source of loans to Venezuela. They were supposed to be paid with oil production, and those have basically been paralyzed, is my understanding. China is basically saying, oh, the interest repayment is deferred, but they're really in default. And so if this new scheme that Rubio discussed, that Hector reported to us, does refloat Venezuelan oil production, who knows, maybe China might be reconciled to the new status quo if it starts getting paid again. So I think that is an angle I haven't seen discussed yet.
I'm going to say something quickly about Russia. This is bad, very bad. So a couple of things. I think, Trump in his first administration, you might remember his then Secretary of State, whose name we all forget, promised that Maduro was about to be ousted and his plane was on the runway, blah, blah, blah. And then a big Russian bomber arrived with some military equipment to Venezuela, maybe more. You guys will know better than I will, but and had been sort of helping move oil covertly. And Rose, you may know more about this too than I do, but that won't stop me from talking. I have a microphone in my hand, but I think the S-300s evidently were impotent. So I think. And also, 3 or 4 days before last Saturday, Putin said something that he really didn't need to say, which was, we stand next to you, Maduro, and basically applauding his dancing. So, it just makes him look extraordinarily weak. And then, of course, the pursuit and seizure of this oil tanker that had quickly changed its registration, and that was purportedly being followed by a Russian submarine as an escort. And the U.S., I think they just boarded it. Have they actually officially boarded it? Yeah. So that was on Russian TV showing the outrageous Americans doing this. That also, doesn't really make Putin look particularly strong. But he's obviously not going. It didn't deter the U.S. and he's not going to have a battle with the U.S. because obviously he's going to lose. Interesting though. to see, and there are lots of other people in the room who can comment on this, what the effect will be on Russia and Ukraine. Because what then stops Putin from, other than the incompetence of the Russian armed forces, going in and trying to pluck Zelensky out of, or any other high leader in Ukraine from his palace or government housing, because Russia views him as illegitimate and a Nazi. And
Catherine, isn't
so
that what
I
they
think,
tried to do in Kiev in the first few days of the war? The
yes, right, and they weren't able to do it. So I mean, I think that's ultimately what stops them. But the worry is, of course, that it makes the war in Ukraine somehow look legitimate. And then finally, there's this whole 19th century view of we have the Western Hemisphere, and then, okay, what about the other hemispheres? And this is very much Putin's view of the world, and evidently as well as Trump's. So, yeah, I'll just stop there. Shall we take another question, Alberto? Okay, Alberto. Okay, so Mike, Albertus, I'm going to start grouping them in a minute.
Yeah, thanks again for the panelists. This has been really fascinating. So one thing that we haven't talked about too much that I'd love to ask about, and can you hear me? Yeah.
There's one right in front of you.
Yeah.
You're good.
Everyone, yeah, great. I think that the panelists provided a really excellent sort of topography of the different of the regime and the remnants of the regime and the different interest groups and the like. And I'm wondering if you could say something about agency within the opposition, to take advantage of that or to use that in a way to try and get a foothold, right? It might be a little bit more difficult right now to repress at a large scale. It's also, of course, very difficult to organize to begin with. But I was wondering if you could say something about agency amongst folks in the opposition in the current landscape. And then a second follow-up one, which was a little bit related to one of Mike's questions, and picks up in part on one thing that you mentioned, Dorothy, about how long it might take for the oil infrastructure to come back online. I mean, how do we think about the stability of this sort of gangster arrangement, this sort of extortion, right? If oil ends up not coming back online very quickly, I could imagine there being quite a lot of infighting.
Also with USAID not able to really go in and help with humanitarian issues. Okay, did you guys get that? Who would like to take it?
Agency one. I think it's very interesting internationally. I think the opposition is moving quickly to get partners to support that the final solution has to be led by Venezuelans, and that the elections have to count, the result of the elections, the will of the people have to count, and that's the only sustainable future in the long term. Even though it has some painful parts in the short term, that equilibrium is possible, and just for some of the preconditions Dorothy described. And domestically, which I think is an interesting point, could protests be an element that makes regime change more likely or less likely? Or how can protests or demonstrations be used inside the country to push further for a democratic transition? I think that's an interesting question. What we're seeing is that people are really scared because the repression, this regime is not very strong, but you just need to be stronger than the organized opposition, right? And the opposition is very organized in civic democratic ways, but it's not a violent opposition. It hasn't built an army, hasn't built a rebellion. Any country in Latin America, I think, or in Central America at least, with 75% collapse in the GDP in 10 years, would have descended into civil war without question. And Venezuela did it. There are some preconditions in society that, and also state capacity, you could say, that I think it's history. It's our history in the 20th century that doesn't make us particularly prone to conflict or civil conflict. But I think that's an interesting question. I think people are really scared, and making people realize these regimes, particularly because of the, communist element, they're really good at taking the sense of agency out of people's psychology. And I think people feel that this is, part of the equation. People feel that there is little we can do, and that they're really ready to use the weapons against their own people. And in that scenario, protests might be very important symbolically, but at the end it will get crushed and hard power will. So I think this is in the minds of a lot of people. So this is why I think we don't see, this is an obstacle for seeing demonstrations, but I do think it's an important element of pressure that can be used to lead the outcome somewhere or another.
Does anybody want to comment on the stability of the arrangement, the gangster
I would love to actually stay on this and just ask another question to Hector about Mike's question about the agency of the opposition, which is to the extent that opposition forces, and not only Machado, but others as well, have agency and either to affect what Washington is doing, right? Or what do you think the opposition should be pushing for and lobbying for in terms of institutional reforms, incremental reforms, or taking the approach that some have taken in the past of first you resign and that's where we're starting? Like how should that agency be used to the extent that it?
Well, I think that a democratic transition will not happen without substantial reform of the security services, the security apparatus, and that's not going to happen within the framework of the existing remnants of the regime. So I think that if the region steps up for a multilateral effort that helps Venezuela to expansively build a security apparatus that is professional, that can serve a democratic administration, that's going to be the point in which I think we can say that this government, that both the US and the regime are serious about moving forward through with a democratic transition. I think there are many ways to do this. Africa offers actually some interesting examples of multilateral efforts, regional efforts to help build domestic security. But I think this is the final goal. I know it sounds unrealistic because the region, we don't have that experience in the region, which is the truth, right? We don't have the experience of how do you rebuild a security service, a security apparatus to make it democratic if the regime doesn't want to do it, which they won't. I think this is going to be the critical point. I do think, however, that most people are not willing to fight. And I think we saw that with Maduro's extraction. They're bullies when you are facing unarmed civilians, but when it comes to a power that is bigger than yours, I think their attitude changes and they become more civilized, I would say. And so I think this has to be part of the horizon. So I would be pushing for this and asking our Latin American partners to step up to the challenge. The fact that the US had to intervene is because we don't have the mechanisms in the region to solve these type of problems on our own. So we cannot, this crisis caused incredible spillovers in the region, not only in terms of criminality, but 9 million Venezuelans left in the last 10 years. There are 3 million Venezuelans in Colombia. This is a middle-income country. The public services are surpassed. And Venezuelan migrants are an element of domestic politics in almost every Latin American country, pushing electorates to the far right. It's an issue, and it's a spillover that is affecting everyone. So if the region, the problem is that these type of regimes, I think, only understand the sticks. The carrots are eaten, but not well appreciated. And I think no one in the region has the power to raise a stick that is big enough for them to say, okay, this is serious. We gotta do something else or else.
Okay, great. Whoops, sorry. Okay, Alberto, are we okay to move on to more questions here? Okay, so I will just warn you on the list, we have Miriam, Oliver, Eric, Jensen, Tom Finger, and we only have 12 minutes. So I'm going to attempt to keep you to just one question and no quick comment. Okay, Miriam, and then Oliver.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists for a really, really remarkable and insightful session. So my question is this: assume that there is some U.S. commitment to a democratic transition because of the domestic pressures coming from Florida. What guarantees would have to be offered to the current regime in order to prompt them to accede to a democratic transition and prevent the country from falling into civil war or chaos, which seems to me still to be a possible an outcome with high probability, let's say. Could a kind of old-fashioned pacted transition work? Is it feasible? Guarantees would have to be given to all of these bad guys that they will not be punished, but that some kind of reconciliation will occur. Is this possible? And let's say within the next 2 years.
Okay, and before we answer that, can you pass that down to Oliver? Thank you. So pact to transition, great question. I was wondering about that.
Thanks to the panelists. This actually builds on both of the previous questions. What happens when Machado slips back in the country?
I like the brevity of that one. Great. Oliver, you win the prize. Okay, who wants to take that?
Harold, do you want to take the first one and I take the second?
Sure, although I'm not sure how much I have to say about the first one. Well, I think that the issue of pact to transition has been on the books for like the last 10 years, probably since the Venezuelan opposition won control of the National Assembly back in, Hector, you'll have to remind me, 2015 maybe? The people have been talking about pacts and transitions and guarantees. Let's face it, the current regime cannot imagine a future where they're not in charge and they're still okay. And in those kinds of circumstances, it's very hard to have any kind of pact. So can the current conditions change that in some way? Can the U.S. involvement change that in some way? It's something to think about. But it's what would it be that would make those commitments credible going forward? And it would have to be really U.S. commitments, because my understanding is the opposition has offered all kinds of pacts and guarantees and sweeteners for stepping out of power. Hector, you probably know a little bit more about this than I do. So the change in the equation is the U.S. intervention. Does that lead to the ability to create some sort of more credible commitment to a future in which the authoritarian elements are not in charge? I don't know. This is maybe, I think one of the things that would be hard is that the current regime in the United States doesn't seem that's committed even to its own policies. So would you believe a commitment delivered by the current administration if you're in the opposition? I'm not in the opposition, in the current authoritarian regime. I'm not sure about that. I really don't know how they're thinking about that. But Hector, I think you actually might have some comments to make about this.
Harold,
Yeah, I think through the years many guarantees have been offered, and the problem is that guarantees are attractive when they're better to the alternative, and they never took seriously what's happening. I think they thought until very recently that the U.S. was not going to invade, was not going to attempt any military operation, and it's not a problem of credibility. Christopher Figuera and others that have cooperated are living their lives somewhere else. I don't know where, but it's not like the U.S. has attacked or imprisoned everybody that have collaborated. It's not true. Some people have escaped and some people have had some life. So it's not a problem of credibility to me, at least not for the big ones that can go into exile. Maybe for the mid ranks that don't have the resources to live a happy life in Qatar, that's true. But for the big ones, I think they have the money to live happy in Istanbul, or I'm not wishing that pestering to poor Turkish people. I mean, but in Qatar or Doha or whatever. But the problem is that the guarantees, I think, are attractive when the stick, sadly, with this type of regimes, when the stick is really big and hit you once at least, apparently. And then things become more attractive. But I don't think they'll take them. And it's not, again, because a credible commitment problem, because the next democratic government is also going to have incentives to incorporate these mid-ranks that have potential for violence. So they will be probably all right. They will probably get paid to stay quiet, use oil rains to pacify the country. So I don't think that's the fear. I just feel that running an oil country is great, my friends. You have a lot of rains and a lot of money that you can control unilaterally, and that's hard to give up.
Yeah, I think just one more thing, Catherine.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, aren't they vulnerable? And they're also indicted, so wouldn't there be some fear that they come in and be grabbed as well, or no?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, Dorothy, I think, might also have something to say about this very quickly.
It's actually Maria.
No, I was going to say, I think the credible threat piece of this is quite important and something that changes with what happened a few days ago as compared to other negotiations that had been attempted in the past, plagued with the typical credible commitment problems, but also with the Maria Corina's line of like wanting to pursue the full specter of justice, which obviously is a disincentive for everyone involved on their end. But even if one could put that aside, I agree. I think the US's biggest role here is actually that of being able to pursue credible threats for non-compliance on behalf of the regime. But there's a question of whether the US is going to be willing to continue to pursue these kinds of sticks
Okay, can
or
we
not.
go to one more question with Eric and Tom, and then we'll come back to the panel to get final
So
comments
again,
from everyone.
terrific panel. I knew it would be. It's really unclear to me how we go from stabilization, recovery, transition without the credible coercive force of the state. And you mentioned this, Hector. We've got this dynamic, Alberto, your point about U.S. coming in, boots on the ground, my God, in Latin America, here we go again. Multilateralism, it seems to be a distant possibility. So push a little further on what might happen domestically. A good portion of the military below the generals voted for Maria. Is there something there to mobilize domestically?
Harold. I don't
Well,
know
I think-
anybody. I cannot offer my opinion, but I think you're the most informed.
Oh, well, I think one of the issues that's involving the Venezuelan military, I completely agree that once you get below the rank of, let's say, lieutenant colonel, they, pretty much look like the rest of the Venezuelan population in terms of the political preferences. And I don't think they would really be an issue, especially if a new incoming government made a commitment to improving living conditions for members of the military, their families. They used to have a good healthcare system, a good pension system. If you give people that plus some professional opportunities, I think it can go a long way quickly. The problem is Venezuela has about 2,000 generals and admirals, which is more than the United States has. So you need to find places for all these people. Now, there may be an example to be found in post-Franco Spain. Spain, although of course a very right-wing regime, not a left-wing regime, was also had an incredible number of admirals and generals. And they went through a whole process of retirements, incentives to retire. You take people, you post them abroad as defense attachés, so they're far away from the rest of the armed forces, or send them to Washington to go to the Inter-American Defense College, or any number of schemes to break up this population so that they can't cause trouble. And I think that's the key thing, is how do you deal with this overdimensioned general and flag officer population? And once you do that, I think you're right, lower down in the ranks, it's going to be less problematic. The other place that you have to address is, of course, the Presidential Honor Guard, the National Intelligence Service, the SEBIN, and the Military General Counterintelligence Directorate, which are all Madurista, best trained, best equipment. You're going to have to figure out how to spread those people around, make sure they can't cause trouble.
I'm now torn whether to go for one more question or to just, I think maybe what we'll do is have you go around, toss it back to you, Alberto, to go around to the panel for any final thoughts, just as we wind down.
Yes, so I guess we have like 30 seconds each of you with any final comment or-
Yeah, right.
So we go in reverse order. Dorothy.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, I will just close by coming back to Miriam's question actually about the possibility of a pacted transition, some sort of power sharing. Are there arrangements that can create credible guarantees for members of the current armed forces? And without trying to comment on the desirability or plausibility of that type of outcome here, I do want to refer Miriam and everyone to what I think is the kind of most developed printed version of that vision, which was an essay in Foreign Affairs called A Grand Bargain for Venezuela. Whether you read this and think this is pie in the sky and dream on and this is never going to happen, or you read it and you think this is what we need to really push for, I think it's really worth engaging with. So I'll just end with that recommendation.
Right. I think that my last comment is, again, it's not going to be an easy fix. I don't think Venezuela is going to be an easy fix, but it's easier. Fixing it is easier than we think. And there will be a gap. I am very pessimistic about the potential, the capacity of the All right, and then I think their capacity is limited. I think the U.S. A lot depends on the U.S. engagement and commitment to keep creating the right incentives for them to behave in the best possible way. But I think we find a moment in which we'll have a gap between an administration that moderate or whatever, however you want to call it, that can actually rebuild a security apparatus that is useful for a democratic transition. And I think that it will have probably most of the people that are already in the security apparatus. I think it's a gap.
We lost the last second, Hector.
This and we have to see if that can be engineered or put forward in any other way. That's my last comment.
I'll be very brief. I think this was Oliver's question. What happens when Machado steps into the country? And I don't know that we answered it, but my best guess would be that if Maria Corina does manage to slip back into Venezuela, she'll be opting for trying to mobilize people and get people out on the streets. That's sort of the only tool and most powerful tool that she has at her disposal now, and one that I would imagine she would try to harness, if not to make to generate some defections among these lower rank members of the military, then to make governance more difficult or to increase the legitimacy of trying to continue to push for a democratic transition in Venezuela among sort of international stakeholders. And I guess I'll end on the note that from 2024 onward, everything that's happened, I think, has been largely difficult to predict from the perspective of Venezuelans, and I think Venezuelan experts more generally. And so this is not to say that the impossible will continue to happen, but it really does seem like anything is possible moving forward. So hopefully it'll be the good thing that we'd all like to happen.
Harold,
And
seconds.
very briefly, just to answer Miriam's question about pacted transitions better, or a little bit better, because I think it's an excellent question. I can imagine a scenario with the U.S. Armada hanging just over the horizon. The regime doesn't really touch Maria Corina Machado because they're worried about what's going to happen to them if they do something to her. And where you proceed towards some kind of negotiation, the way that it happened in Nicaragua after Chamorro was elected. They spent the next years figuring out what things were going to look like. Of course, eventually the regime deteriorated and fell apart. Ortega came back. But you could imagine a regime where initially there was quite a few reserved domains, made quite a bit of autonomy for the armed forces, for example. But nevertheless, they got to something that was not a dictatorship. And I think that would be a great place for Venezuela to start, and then work towards improving and achieving a full democracy.
Thank you, Hector, Harold, I'm sorry, Harold, Hector, Maria, Dorothy, Diego. In closing, I just want to say one thing. At the Democracy Action Lab, one of the things we had already been working on is to create a repository of some resources on Venezuela, in particular, and we wanted to make sure there would be like a microsite. This becomes even more urgent today. So I want to kind of apologize to the attendees who had all these questions that we couldn't get to, more questions that I'm sure are in the room, in the Perry room. But what I promise from our standpoint, from the Democracy Action Lab, Beatriz Magaloni and myself, we'll make sure we get to your questions, and we will put resources out there. We will make sure we also distribute things like Francisco Monaldi's work on the future of Venezuelan oil, or Francisco Rodriguez's vision of the grand bargain. You know, all these resources are things that the lab is committed to precisely bridge the space between academic, scholarly research, very careful research that is being done by all the people in this conversation, and many people out there, I'm sure, in the Zoom, and the commitment to be engaged with the real world problems and very, very difficult challenges of today in Venezuela, but also for the hemisphere as a whole. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone in the room, and thank you, everyone in the attendee soon.
Thank you.